Individual racism. Individual racism is when a person holds negative attitudes or beliefs about others based on their race. These views can be conscious or unconscious, influencing how a person behaves towards others. It's important to understand that individual racism is more than just isolated incidents. It's a reflection of how society influences personal beliefs and actions. Many people may not realize the impact their beliefs have on others, but it contributes to larger societal issues. Institutional racism. Institutional racism occurs within organizations like schools, businesses, or governments. This type of racism can be found in rules, practices, or procedures that seems natural but result in unequal treatment of different racial groups. These policies can affect many aspects of life, like education, job opportunities, and access to healthcare. Over time, institutional racism can become so embedded that it's hard to detect, yet it consistently disadvantages specific groups. Structural racism. Structural racism goes deeper than just individual or institutional racism. It is a cumulative effect of racism that happens across multiple institutions and systems, like housing, education, and the justice system. Structural racism creates a cycle where one disadvantage leads to another, making it difficult for marginalized groups to escape inequality. It affects entire communities and can last for generations, showing how deeply rooted racism can be in society. Cultural racism. Cultural racism is about how societies view and value different cultures. It occurs when the culture of one racial group is seen as superior to others, often through the media, education, or social norms. This can lead to certain cultural practices being devalued or even erased. Cultural racism can be subtle, influencing how we view history, art, language, and even everyday behavior. It shapes what is considered normal or acceptable, often placing one group's culture above all others. Interpersonal racism. Interpersonal racism happens in direct interactions between people. It's expressed through inequality, discrimination, or harmful behavior in everyday life. Even small, seemingly insignificant comments or actions can have a big impact over time. These interactions, though often minimized, accumulate and can contribute to the broader environment of racism. Understanding interpersonal racism helps us realize that individual actions, however small, matters in the large picture of inequality. Internalized racism. Internalized racism occurs when individuals from marginalized racial groups start to accept and believe the negative stereotypes or ideas about their own race. This can result in feeling of inferiority, self-hatred, and rejection of one's cultural identity. Over time, internalized racism can have deep emotional and psychological impacts, causing people to question their own worth and identity. It shows how racism can affect not only how people are treated, but how they view themselves. Systematic racism. Systematic racism refers to how all these forms of racism, individual, institutional, and structural, work together to create a system that maintains racial inequalities. It's built into structures of society and affects things like employment, education, housing, and healthcare. Systematic racism is not about individual acts of discrimination. It's about how society as a whole operates in a way that disadvantages some racial groups while privileging others. Environmental racism. Environmental racism occurs when certain racial groups are more likely to live in areas with environmental hazards such as pollution or unsafe water. These communities often have less political power and are more vulnerable to decisions that negatively affect their environment. Environmental racism highlights how racial inequality can impact health, safety, and overall well-being, often affecting people for generations. Subtle or covert racism. Subtle racism is harder to detect because it's not as blatant or direct. It might come in the form of small, seemingly harmless comments or actions that, when looked at closely, reveals deeper bias. Subtle racism can manifest in decisions or behavior that on the surface don't seem racist but still maintain racial activities. Because it's less observed, subtle racism can persist unnoticed, making it challenging to address. Aversive racism. Aversive racism is type of subtle racism where people believe they are not racist, yet they still harbor unconscious bias or negative feelings towards certain racial groups. This form of racism allows individuals to maintain a self-image of being fair or non-prejudiced even though their behavior or attitudes may still contribute to inequality. Aversive racism is particularly harmful because it prevents meaningful discussions about race, making it harder to address and solve. Colorism. Colorism is closely related to racism but focuses specifically on the preference for lighter skin over darker skin. Even within the same racial or ethnic group, this form of discrimination can influence many aspects of life, from beauty standards to social status, and often leads to better opportunities for those with lighter skin. Colorism reinforces harmful ideas about race and beauty, deepening social divides even within marginalized groups.